Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, and I'm sitting right next to Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to be here with you.
Hey, Brandon. Yeah, it's usually we're an entire continent away when we talk to each other. So
Yeah.
It's nice being in the same room.
It is, and the room we're in is just a few paces away from the headquarters of Facebook. That's why we're here in San Francisco, California, because in just a few hours, Bishop Barron is going to be giving a talk to employees at Facebook titled How to Have a Religious Argument. I mentioned it during the last episode, but it'll take place today, which is Monday, September 18th at 3 p.m. Pacific time out here where we are. That's 6 p.m. Eastern time, and you can stream the whole talk through Bishop Barron's Facebook page. If you're listening to this after the talk has already occurred, you can find the talk on his page or on the Word on Fire website. But I thought during this episode, again, we're about a few hours away from your talk, we just walk through the talk and cover some of the main themes you're going to be discussing. Now, you start off by talking about an exchange between Bill Maher and Ralph Reed that in many ways exhibits how not to have a religious argument. Talk about this exchange.
Yeah, I'll confess that watching Bill Maher is a bit of a guilty pleasure for me, because he drives me crazy. He's one of the most ferocious atheists on the scene. Well, one night he had Ralph Reed, who of course is a Christian, evangelical Christian, and very involved in the political conversation. So they're talking about politics, but then finally Bill Maher said to him, "Now you're a man of faith, which means that you accept a lot of things on the basis of no evidence whatsoever." And Ralph Reed said, "Yes." And I remember I was in my room. I wanted to throw the remote at the TV screen, and I shouted out loud, "No, that's not what it means to be a person of faith." See, coming out of the Catholic tradition, we hold to faith and reason. Faith is not under reason, it's over reason. It's not less than reasonable, it's beyond reason, and always in accord with reason, see? And so the view that, in one part of my life I'm very rational, and I think things through and have evidence and all that. Then there's other kind of kooky part of my life where I just believe any old thing at all. That's precisely what faith is not. As Newman said, I've always loved this little one-liner, faith is the reasoning of a religious mind. Now, to unpack that, we'd have to do all of Newman's thought, but that gives you a much clearer sense of the Catholic approach, which I'll be defending today at Facebook.
You also liken faith to a form of trust, and you give an example about meeting somebody for the first time. Talk about that.
Well, see, I think that's the most apt analogy for faith-reason, is when you come to know a human being, right? Reason plays a hugely important role in that. You could talk to people who know that person. You could Google search that person. You could do a criminal background check. You could do your own observations from a distance. You could use your reason to learn a lot about that person, right? And all that's great. Then let's say you decide, yeah, I really want to get to know this guy or this gal personally. Now you meet and you go out for lunch or dinner and you get to know them better. And you're going to find a lot of things that you couldn't have discovered on the Google search. But then there's going to come a moment, if the friendship really becomes more intimate, where that person will reveal her heart to you. She'll tell you something about her deepest feelings or thoughts or motivations or dreams that you would never know any other way. You could never know it from an objective Google search. No criminal background check would tell you that. No other person could tell you. She's decided in a very intimate way to open her heart to you. Now, at that point, you have a choice to make. You can say, I trust her. I believe that. I accept that to be true, or not. In other words, you come to a moment of faith. Mind you, not under reason or prior to reason, but at the far limit of reason. A truth now that's not available to reason has been revealed to you by this person whom you've come to trust. And you decide, and it is an act of the will, Aquinas will say, you decide to have faith. You accept it. To me, that's a very apt analogy for how faith and reason work. There's a lot we can know about God through objective, philosophical argumentation, analysis, thought. Think of all the different, arguments for God's existence. We can talk about God's attributes, God's relation to the world, read the first 20 questions or so of the Summa of Aquinas, etc. Good. Reason plays a key role. The claim, though, of the church is that God has not remained simply at a distance as an object of our contemplation, but rather God has acted. God has chosen personally to reveal himself to Israel and then in Jesus Christ, revealing things that we never know through reason. We never could know because it's God opening his heart to us, if you want. Now, at that moment, we got a choice to make. Do I accept it? Do I believe it or not? God's not asking for a sacrificium intellectus, a sacrifice of the mind. Just as this person you've come to know, I hope she's not saying, now forget everything you've ever known about me. No. She's assuming that, right? So God, in a similar way, is now going to reveal something of his heart. So what's faith classically? Faith is the trusting response to revelation. That's the way you might describe it. God's not just out there dumbly at a distance waiting to be known by our searching minds. God has revealed, unveiled something to us, and now we trust in it. That's faith. And I hope what's clear from this analogy is it's not opposed to reason, and it's not accepting any old crazy thing on the basis of no evidence. It's a trusting response to a person I've come to believe.
We're talking here about how to have a religious argument. That's the title of the talk that Bishop Barron's going to give to Facebook employees here in a few hours. After discussing the true understanding of faith, Bishop, you then move to some of the biggest blocks to having healthy religious discussions. And number one, which is not going to be a surprise to many listeners of this show, is scientism. How does scientism block good religious dialogue?
Yeah. You know that image I've always loved of shooting the horse in the starting gate, and they're off, and you shoot, and there the horse is dead before the race even begins. Scientism has that effect on religious conversation. Scientism is the view that the scientific way of knowing is the only legitimate way of knowing the truth, that all manners of knowledge are reducible to the scientific manner. So the scientific method of empirical observation, followed by the formation of hypotheses, followed by the testing of hypotheses through experimentation, followed by a drawing of conclusions, then probably a retesting of what you've determined. That's a great method for knowing certain things about reality. There's a certain swath of reality that's revealed to us through that method. And it's been massively successful. So I'm going to be speaking to Facebook and think of, the technology which has come from the scientific method and that we all benefit from massively. So I understand the temptation to say that's the only legitimate way to know, and that anything else is just kind of less than real knowledge, or it's, superstition, or it's subjectivism, or it's your own little impression or something. That's the danger of scientism. See, religion is not by any means opposed to science, but I might say it's a closer cousin to things like philosophy or literature or poetry, by which I mean it's a way of knowing. Just as Shakespeare isn't science, but Shakespeare reveals enormous truths about human life and psychology and fate and everything else. Plato's dialogues aren't science, but who's going to say they reveal no truth to us whatsoever about the way the world is? Dante's Divine Comedy isn't science, but who's going to say there's nothing true in it? They're not just aesthetically pleasing, they're truth-bearing, these things. And I'm going to say, if you accept that, you should accept this close cousin to these things, namely religious discourse, revelation, as not just entertaining or not just a nice hobby, but as truth-bearing. So what happens with scientism is we just shoot the horse in the starting gate. Is that the minute you try to talk reasonably about religion, somebody goes, nope, it's not science, therefore it's ruled out. There's absolutely no warrant for that. And then I'll make this argument too, that scientism is, strictly speaking, self-refuting, right? The one thing you can't determine on scientific grounds is that science is the only way to know truth, right? That's a philosophical claim, not a scientific claim. You didn't derive that from the proper use of the scientific method. That's a philosophical assumption. Now, we could argue that assumption, but don't tell me, you can't use philosophy as a way of knowing, because you're using it as a way of knowing in the very articulation of your scientific assumption.
Another block that you'll talk about that prevents healthy religious dialogue is voluntarism. What is that, and why does it harm religious argument?
Man, I think it's rampant today, voluntarism. It's a very old problem. Voluntarism says basically that will trumps intellect, that things are true because, now in its original form, voluntarism was a theological position. So go back to the Middle Ages and even earlier. Why are things true? Well, because God wanted it. Why is 2 plus 2 equal to 4? Well, because God wanted that. What if God wanted it to be 5? Well, then it would be. Descartes says that. I mean, the great founder of modern philosophy was a voluntarist. Why is adultery wrong? Because God decided it was wrong. What if God decided it was a virtue? Then it would be. So he says the voluntarist. It was a way of honoring the power of God, the sovereignty of God, right? Thomas Aquinas never held to voluntarism, though. You know, Thomas would see the truth of God and the will of God as cohering. They're coincident, you know. Now, to tell this whole story, we need a whole course in philosophy, but I think this voluntarism in the arena of God was answered by a voluntarism in the anthropological realm in modernity. So look at someone like Nietzsche, right? The Übermensch, the Superman, who's beyond good and evil in the conventional sense, by a sheer act of will, determines the meaning of his life. You know, the will to power over everything, including questions of meaning. Now, a 20th century Nietzsche is Jean-Paul Sartre, the founder of existentialism. Existence precedes essence, he says, meaning freedom comes first, and I determine on that basis who I am, what my life is about. Again, will trumping intellect. I think this is now, this Nietzschean, Sartrean voluntarism has trickled down into the general population, and you see it everywhere today. Why is something true? Well, because I want it to be true. I determine the meaning of life. Now look at Casey versus Planned Parenthood, right? As I've commented many times, many others have too, when the Supreme Court of our country said it belongs to the very nature of liberty to determine the meaning of my own life. That's voluntarism in its pure form. Now, why is voluntarism a problem? Because it undermines anything like real religious argumentation. If will trumps intellect, well, we can't really argue these things. All we can do is shout at each other, impose our wills. Who's got a more powerful will? Is this around today? Look at the headlines almost every day. Look at what's happening on our campuses, etc. You see not a clash of ideas, but a clash of wills. And that is going to stand in the way of argumentation. And I'd press this point. It stands in the way of real peace. Because all I got is a clash of wills. This thing will turn violent very fast, right? I can't argue with you. I gotta beat you into submission. I've got to compel you to believe what I believe. That's a recipe for violence. I want argumentation, not violence.
I see that often online and offline with people. They say things like, you can't even argue with those types of people. And the implication is that, so you just have to force your will upon them. Do you see that? Absolutely. I think it's all over the internet space, which is why I want to address it today. I know it's a little bit controversial, but go back to the famous Regensburg Address of Benedict XVI, which became so controversial because of the statements about Islam, which are actually a very minor part of that speech. That speech is all about this problem. And I think what Benedict saw was what I just mentioned, that the breakdown of truth leads to violence. And he saw that now up and down the centuries, in both Islam and Christianity and elsewhere. That's our problem. And I think it's rampant today. Do you find it ironic that a lot of people accuse the Catholic Church of only being able to promote its agenda through violence? Yet, to me, it seems the opposite is true. It's the Catholic Church who's trying to make a rational case for a lot of these things, and it's the opposition violently pushing back. Yeah,
look at John Paul II's Fides et Ratio, toward the end of his papacy. George Weigel's pointed this out, that one of the great ironies is, at the end of the 20th century, the great advocate for reason on the world stage was the Pope of Rome. So the Enlightenment begins in this great burst of, it's reason, 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 and down with, old superstitious religion. But what's happened to reason in so much of the West, look at our high universities, is devolved into nihilism and into deconstructionism and into radical skepticism and all this, and in forms of voluntarism. I think it's true that the church is doing what it's always done. It's advocated reason. Again, go back to Ratzinger, where he said very early on the church faced a decision. Would it go with logos or mythos? Would it go with the path of reason or the path of mythology in sort of propagating its point of view? And of course, mythos, that was a dominant thought form in the ancient world. And someone like Arius is a good example. Aryan Christology is kind of like, it's like Hercules, it's a mythic thing, where the church opted not for mythos, but for logos, for reason. And it's followed that at its best. It's followed that path all the way. It resisted someone like Tertullian, who said, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? That famous, oh, look, we have Revelation, we have God. Why do we bother with philosophy? The church powerfully said no to that. Just as I find it interesting, the iconoclast controversy of someone like John Damascene, when there was a temptation to say, oh no icons, no representation, and John of Damascus said no, and from that came the great Catholic visual tradition. In a similar way, when the church said no to Tertullian, it opened the door to Anselm and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and everybody else. So the church has been an advocate of reason, still is, ironically.
We're talking again about Bishop Barron's talk at Facebook's headquarters in just a few hours. It's titled How to Have a Religious Argument. And we've covered some of the early themes from the talk where he traces the philosophical history of how we've gotten to this rough patch that we're in today. But then you move on to some practical suggestions on how we can actually start reviving healthy religious dialogue. One of the things you recommend is that before launching into a response to someone else's religious argument, that you need to first understand your opponent's position. What are some good ways to do this?
Yeah, I'm speaking very much out of personal experience here because I get how tempting it is. You're online, right? You've made an argument of some kind, and then someone comes roaring back at you, which they do. It's very rare in the internet space someone say, dear Bishop, I really enjoyed the argument you made and find it compelling, and this is good, but I do have one question about this, and I say it with great respect. I mean, no one talks that way, and you know that too, right? No one talks that way. What you get is, well, you are crazy, and you're out of your mind, and I'm cleaning up the language, believe me. And so there's a great temptation, and I felt it, believe me, to say, come blasting back and all that. Look, religion, as Paul Tillich said, is ultimate concern, right? So we're concerned about all kinds of stuff, but our ultimate concern is what we call religion. And so it's not surprising that when you get into this arena, of religion, there's going to be a lot of strong feeling, right, stirred up. So you have to just kind of realize that, like, okay, I get it. This really is going to get you worked up. So how about a step back? And I do find, though I don't always follow it, I'll confess, it's good to step back and say something like, what I hear you saying, if I get this right, I hear you saying that, and I'll say X, Y, and Z. Or the concern behind your question that I'm picking up is, and I wonder if I have this right. See, that way you're not just blasting back with, no, you're wrong. You're really trying to understand the person's perspective, but you're also creating a little bit of like timeout space,
a safe space.
A safe space, and a little like timeout. Okay, why don't we both just kind of step back from the precipice here? And I go back to my time when I was going through seminary. We were all enamored of the psychologist Carl Rogers, and Rogers is famous for this method called unconditional positive regard, and we all practiced it. Like you go in to talk to someone in the hospital or something, and they start talking, and the method is to say, what I hear you saying is that it's really been a tough day for you, and then they go on. But what I'm picking up now is that you're really frustrated with, and you're sort of mirroring back to the person, and what you're doing, and I get this, you're convincing him or her, you're listening, you're paying attention. They know, oh yeah, okay, he did hear what I said, And that tends to awaken a more positive response. That's Roger's thing. And I think as far as it goes, that's true. So maybe practice a little Rogerian psychology in these internet settings. What the question I'm hearing is this: do I have that right? And I think that's just it's a practical thing. And again, I don't always follow it, but I think it's a wise method.
You also lift up Thomas Aquinas, and we're going to get into his disputatio method here in a second, but one element of him that you particularly admire is how he often states his opponent's positions even more clearly and stronger than they would.
Love that. Yeah. I might tell this, if I have time, tell this little anecdote, that during the early years of the Enlightenment, when the French philosophes, were doing their anti-religious speculation, many times they would take objections from the Summa of Aquinas and use them as their own arguments. Now, why? Well, because Thomas formulated them so elegantly and so convincingly. Now, what they skipped was that Thomas answered the objections. But it's a tribute to Aquinas that there's such a temptation to engage in straw man argumentation, right? I get it.
What do you mean by that?
But I mean, you give a very weak version that barely resembles what the person really is arguing, and then you knock it down and say, well, that's clearly wrong. Well, yeah, but you're not really reflecting my position. You're just setting up a straw man, Thomas Aquinas never sets up straw men. I mean, I think it's one of his great virtues as a thinker is he presents the opponent's position often more convincingly and more pithily than the opponent would. And only thereby can we come to real advance in knowledge and not just a clash of wills. Let me show you. I'm tougher than you are. I'm cleverer than you are.
I can scream louder than you
I can scream louder than you, yeah. No. He so respects his opponent's point of view that he formulates it in a very pithy, convincing way. And that is a great model for our dialogue today.
Let's close here with a little bit more about Thomas Aquinas. You will close your talk in a few hours, describing Thomas as the best model of healthy religious argument, particularly because of his method. We talked a little bit about it, but what else in the way Thomas Aquinas engaged his opponents is imitable? There's
so much, that just walk through a typical article in the Summa of Aquinas, and what you see is a literary version of, you mentioned the quaestio disputata, right? The disputed question was the way they really learned in the Middle Ages. It wasn't through lecture so much. It was through this very lively public exchange of views where you propose an issue, then you entertain objections from the floor, and a great number of them, followed by a resolution of the issue by the master. And there's one thing I want to point out today at Facebook is Thomas, yes, is very generous in the way he entertains opponents, very respectful of their point of view. However, he doesn't leave it simply open-ended, like, the romance of the quest, and, we never really come to resolution. No, he knew what Chesterton knew, that the mind is like, as he said, the open mouth. It's meant to bite down on something nourishing. The mind is meant to make a judgment, So Thomas does. But then he returns to the opponent's objections with deep respect and understanding. And maybe I'd highlight this. Very typically, Thomas says, here's what's right in the objection. The objector has got a very good point. However, if we see it in a wider context, we understand why it's not an insuperable problem. But he points out something positive because, let's face it, almost always in regard to these questions, there's something right in what the opponent is saying. I mean, there's rarely just a knockdown argument. You're dead wrong, I'm dead right. There's almost always something right in what your opponent is saying. And Aquinas is willing and able to do that. So that's just one of the many things I find admirable in the method.
Well, one last question here. Again, we're just a few hours away from going to Facebook. And again, I want to give a shout out to Bill, our good friend at Facebook, who helped coordinate a lot of this. Thanks so much, Bill, for your great hospitality and all the Catholic employees there at Facebook for hosting us. But Bishop, did you ever think 5-10 years ago that you'd be standing at Facebook's headquarters giving a talk on religion? What does this mean to you?
It's good. It's very good. I mean, I probably wouldn't have known what that was 5 years ago.
Facebook?
What do you mean Facebook headquarters? No, I remember watching the movie, The Social Network, right? Social Network, which I love. It's a very good movie. And no, I think it means a lot. And I'm very grateful, too, to the people at Facebook and those who helped arrange for this. And it's a sign, I think, of goodwill on their part, their openness to a religious point of view. And I think, look, we're at the nerve center of communications on planet Earth in many ways. So that's where the church ought to be. I think if you want, this is the Areopagus of today, right? Where Paul Paul introduced himself, and he got laughed at by a lot of people. Most walked away. Reread that. Is it chapter 17?
Acts 17.
Yeah. Reread it sometime. Anyone listening to us now. And I love that because Paul goes into this public forum and hostile to his point of view. Yeah, most people were. But there's the beginning of European Christianity in many ways. And Paul's first great mission to Greece. Everything else flowed from that. If Paul had gone back to wherever he went that night, back to his house or his room and said, "Oh, brother, why am I bothering?" But he hung in there, and from that came all of European Christianity, from which came African Christianity and Latin American Christianity. So think about that. And not, I'm not saying Paul, but I mean to take the opportunity to go on the Areopagus today, and even if I don't know, most people aren't going to listen, or many would walk away or scoff. But it's not. I don't have to worry about that. That's up to God now. What will God do with it? That's up to God.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our listeners. Today we have a question from Tom in Rhode Island, and he asked something right along the lines of what we've been discussing here. Here's Tom's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Tom from Providence, Rhode Island, and I have a three-part searching question on truth inspired by my nun friends. 1. How can one find objective truth by reason alone? 2. If there is such a thing as objective truth, how can the Catholic Church claim fullness of it when the Muslim and Protestant seem equally as convicted? 3. If one is entirely convicted in the truth of the gospel, how can he or she be open in dialogue when it would seem they can't, quote, change their mind by definition? Thank you, and God bless you.
Yeah, you're right. Those are all searching questions. We need a whole course probably in fundamental theology to deal with those. Maybe the last one I'll just look at the time that we have. Let's say you're convinced of your political position. I don't think anyone's going to say, "Oh, it's just my little subjective point of view, and I don't think I'm really right. I just happen to hold this, and I'm going to tolerate your point of view." No, political people I know are very willing to enter into public conversation and dialogue and argumentation about their position. They're not reticent about that, and they want you to believe what they believe, and they'll make an argument for it. Or if you're a scientist and you hold to a point of view that you're convinced is objectively correct, yeah, of course you want to argue people out of it. You don't just say, "Oh, I'm going to tolerate all points of view, and if you want to be a flat Earth, a person, that's fine with me." No, you're going to enter into public argument. Why do we think religion is different? I mean, why can't you say, "Yeah, I think my religious point of view is correct. I want you to believe it too, and so I'm going to make an argument. I'm not going to kill you or throw you in prison or beat you over the head or I want to argue." See, that's what I'm urging today, is that we can have in the public forum something like a rational exchange about religion. And I don't know why religion is different here than politics or anything else, where people, yeah, of course they think something's objectively right, and they want to argue people into it. I don't see why religion would be an exception to that. The first observation, it's an old question about objective truth, and I would just do a kind of tu quoque, or sort of a runaround of someone that makes that claim, because anyone that claims, there's really no objective truth. Well, that's an objective truth claim, right? That there's no objective truth, I'm claiming is objectively true. Because if it's just subjectively the case, why would I bother trying to convince you of it? So the person is just sawing off the branch he's sitting on, and that's Augustine's answer to the skeptics of his own time, which is grounded in Plato's answer to the skeptics of his time. So that's a very, very old argument, but there's, I think, very little to it.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. Bishop Barron's Talk at Facebook isn't the only exciting thing going on at Word on Fire. We also have a new book coming out. This new book is titled "To Light a Fire on the Earth, Proclaiming the Gospel in a Secular Age." It's Bishop Barron's latest book, and it's co-written with John Allen Jr., one of the most respected, renowned Vatican journalists in the world. The book is a book-length conversation between the two men, and it shares Bishop Barron's thoughts on all sorts of issues, from God to atheism to beauty to social media and much more. The book officially debuts on October 31st, Halloween, but we have a special deal for you. For Word on Fire Show listeners, you can visit the website wordonfireshow.com/book. Again, wordonfireshow.com/book, and you can pre-order the book at 25% off, so less than $20. It's cheaper than you'll find it anywhere else, and you get free shipping, and you get 3 extra ebooks from Bishop Barron. So it's a no-brainer. If you want to pick up Bishop Barron's new book, just go to wordonfireshow.com/book. Well, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire Show.